Welcome to Football Conspiracies.
I'm Jared Cole.
And I'm Jared Rabinovich.
This week's episode, the CTE Cover Up.
Wait, do you have any banter for us?
Oh, of course I have banter. I always come prepared.
Well, I mean, that's only half true.
Well, you just gotta give me a second to pull it up. Yeah, I have the exact thing. So we're recording this on Monday, so we've been grateful enough to watch some Nickelodeon football.
Yes, of course, our
and
favorite.
during the Chargers game, when the Chargers were up 6-0, Jim Harbaugh was snatched by the dirty bubble.
Oh, yes, he was. I saw this graphic.
Immediately after, the Chargers threw an interception and were outscored 32-6 from that moment.
Well, I mean, the dirty bubble scared the shit out of me when I was a kid on SpongeBob. So, I mean,
it scared the shit out of Jim Harbaugh in real life, apparently.
That's what I'm saying. I think maybe this is the realest curse we've seen.
Yeah, so, yeah, there you go.
That is indeed some good banter. I'm glad you brought that here for us today.
I could honestly be a real conspiracy, too.
This could be a real one.
Yeah, the dirty bubble cursed Jim Harbaugh. You
All
heard
right.
it here first.
We'll just have to wait for the dirty bubble to take away another coach, and then we'll see what happens.
Exactly.
So for the main portion of today's episode, we're going to be talking about the CTE Cover Up. This is a pretty big issue in the NFL over the past handful of years, and I think it was definitely time that we covered this topic. While it's a lot more serious than some of the other stuff we cover, I think it is one of the more, what J. Cole said before this episode, we learned what it was about, real conspiracies in the NFL.
Yeah, this is like an actual real conspiracy, whereas most of the stuff we bring you is just like fun conspiracy.
And even if it's not fun, it's still wacky or
wild, yeah,
in some sort of way. But this one is a little less pilled, if you will.
Okay, before we get too far into the seriousness, I have like sort of a jokesy thing to bring to this.
Please.
It just reminded me just because Antonio Brown is CTE.
Well, he will be coming up.
Yeah, I saw recently that the Jets are the first team to cause 2 all-star wide receivers who play for a Florida-based team to leave during a game in MetLife.
That is one of the most wildly specific stats I've ever seen.
Well, they're the only team to do it twice.
Well, yeah, I guess the rest of it is just a coincidence. If you phrase it like that, it sounds insane.
But I mean, Antonio Brown and Tyreek Hill, he walked off week 18.
Man, we're going to have to start looking into the MetLife curse, aren't we?
Yeah.
So, onto the
real stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, enough with this banter.
So, quickly, I'm just going to give a brief overview of CTE to give some context for what the rest of today's episode is really going to be about. So over the past handful of years, CTE has definitely become one of those spoken about topics in the football world, at least anecdotally from my perspective.
Oh, yeah. I mean, every time I see someone get a concussion on the field, immediately I go CTE.
Exactly. Yeah, or every single play when the center's head hits the other center's head and...
Yeah, like even those
repeated contacts. Yes, but sorry, for those of you who are unfamiliar with CTE... CTE is a brain disorder that seems to be caused by repeated blows to the head. Symptoms may include memory loss, social instability, impulsive behavior, and poor judgment. Oftentimes, CTE is observed showing people being pretty unstable in public, which is something that has been observed in a lot of former football players and other former athletes. The big issue with CTE, though, aside from, the horrible symptoms it has, is the fact that it cannot be diagnosed unless the patient is already dead. The diagnosis process includes slicing open the affected person's brain. No other diagnostic method has been discovered as of yet. Because of this, many victims of CTE suffer for years and take on the consequences of the disorder without ever knowing, or in some cases even suspecting, that something may be wrong with them. For decades, the traumatic brain injury suffered by NFL players and other athletes went largely unexamined. In recent years, however, there has been a slew of research looking into these cases. While CTE as a topic of discussion in the NFL space was often put on the back burner, recent studies and events have brought it to the forefront of many people's minds. I'm sure a lot of you, when I say that, are thinking of examples of some pretty terrible injuries or some bad things former NFL players or current NFL players did that may have indicated that and the discourse it caused. The main catalyst to this becoming a more spoken about CTE, becoming a more spoken about topic, I believe, is that many NFL players are now beginning to speak about it themselves. This has been a huge game changer.
Yeah, I mean, you see it just from their personal choices of the different helmets and the different helmet add-ons they choose to wear to try and limit the amount of CTE they get. Because it is degrees, like you can get it worse than others, and so they're trying to limit their concussions and CTEs, just, and you can see it on the field, like right on their heads.
Exactly. The development of the Guardian caps, which for those unfamiliar is an extra protective layer people can put on top of their helmets. There's a lot of controversy around it because it looks silly, but they're incredibly effective, and all NFL players should at least consider wearing them.
Yeah,
it's
I saw a guy on Twitter saying that they should ban the Guardian cap because it looks stupid and people have gotten concussions while wearing them.
Yeah, it's some negative IQ takes we're seeing, and you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of those people who are like, you know why we shouldn't have wind turbines? They're an eyesore. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? No one...
Yeah, no, like we need those. They cool the earth, like they fan the earth.
You know? Oh yeah, that's what they do. that's honestly the craziest thing I've heard this entire podcast episode. Every episode, that's an insane thing to say.
Yeah, you didn't know that?
Either way, just it reminds me of that logic of even though it's useful, I think it ugly, which is also just wrong because I don't know if you've seen wind turbines. They're kind of beautiful.
Yeah, they're massive fans.
Yeah, pretty cool if you ask me.
Yeah.
So as we were speaking about professional athletes beginning to speak out about CTE, one prominent example that definitely came to my mind when I was writing this was former Eagles center Jason Kelce, brother of Taylor Swift's boyfriend. In a recent tweet, Jason Kelce wrote this.
I mean, I can virtually guarantee that I have CTE. All the research would suggest I have some degree of it. I think it is entirely reasonable to assume I have some degree of that pathology. Even though there is no test to see if I currently have CTE, the evidence suggests I probably do. Just like the reality that a lot of, if not most of, the high-level horses of the 70s and 80s were doping because adequate tests were not available.
So what do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a weird comparison, but
okay.
it checks.
Yeah, like the essence makes sense.
Yeah, the essence of the argument makes sense, but like
you're confused with that last part.
Using steroids versus checking for brain injuries just seems like a little bit of a weird comparison.
No, and you're absolutely right. I know this last part might seem discordant, and it is. But this tweet actually comes in a little bit of context. It came after Jason got into a small Twitter feud with Jay Privman, which I know he's one of your favorites, J. Cole. He's a former horse racing journalist. I know you're big into that these days. Yeah. And he got into this feud when he suggested that Secretariat was on roids.
Oh.
So this was in response to Jay Privman.
Okay.
Exactly.
Was Secretariat on roids?
I've not looked into the claims. Honestly, I should have, because that would have been a great reveal at this moment in the episode. But Jason Kelce certainly seems to think so, and Jay Privman is offended by the take.
Okay, next week we'll have an update.
Exactly. Yeah, we'll come back to you with the Secretariat roids drama. Breaking news from the 80s.
Honestly.
On top of this comment from Jason, I've also seen some claims made by random posters online mostly that some of Kelce's behavior in the past couple of years, namely him getting into an altercation with a fan at a Chiefs game, I don't know if you remember this, may point to the fact that he does have CTE, as he rightly, or as he thinks he does himself.
Well, I mean, I've seen a couple of times where, like, Jason Kelce has, like, quote-unquote acted out a bit, but like all of it seemed reasonable.
Yeah, I know. Like, I recently saw that TMZ report of him like getting into an altercation with a fan in like a parking garage, and it was literally like some fans screaming at him, and he was like standing there silently. I don't think he said a word.
I remember seeing he took a fan's phone and smashed it against the ground.
That is the altercation I'm referring to at this moment.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
there we go.
There you go. So yes, like I was saying, a lot of people point to that incident of maybe a symptom of CTE. Well, I think
No. Well, I mean,
having been attributed to CTE.
I mean, you could attribute it to CTE. Doesn't mean it was the CTE that made him
No,
do
of
it.
course,
You know
of course.
mean?
No. I'm not
Like-
saying that, but a lot of people are saying it wouldn't have happened if he hadn't suffered so much head trauma. Is the general sense, the hypothesis. I'm not saying I agree with this. This is what I've seen online. And, like, what I think is that this is entirely conjecture and completely unsubstantiated. But I think it was worth bringing up in the context of the story.
100%, yeah.
And I think on this note, it's also worth mentioning that Jason Kelce is far from the only former NFL player to have this concern. A recent survey conducted by Harvard University found that of the 1,980 former NFL players who responded, a staggering 681 said they believed they had CTE. That's a rate of over 30%.
Wow.
Yeah, that's like incredibly high, way higher than I ever would have suspected.
Honestly, good for them for knowing that for like being honest with themselves.
I think that's like a pretty high rate of people who have that concern.
Yeah.
It's just wild to me. It was kind of scary, to be honest. Either way, this sort of discourse, players openly admitting that they may be struggling with the symptoms of CTE, was essentially unheard of until the last few years, or maybe decade or so. On top of this, there has been a huge increase in online discourse regarding CTE, and specifically regarding players whom people suspect may be suffering from the disorder. I can personally think of a handful of examples off the top of my head. I think the most prominent one is probably O.J. Simpson.
Oh, yeah.
Over the last decade or so, there has been a marked increase in the conversation that O.J.'s quote-unquote crimes, for legal reasons, the quote-unquote, likely would not have taken place if he had not suffered from CTE. While there is no confirmation that he did, in fact, suffer from CTE, he did not donate his brain to science after his death for us to find out. Many people have chalked up the erratic behavior he was notorious for in his retirement up to being a symptom of CTE.
Like, I can see it, but I mean, yeah. Like I can see it in the fact that he probably murdered those people, and even his altercation after he was out of jail when he sold that fan some memorabilia and then tried to steal it back.
Yeah, well, it was armed robbery of his own memorabilia.
Yeah,
it was like a
that's
pretty crazy instance.
Also, what a dick for not giving your brain to science. Like, I feel like every football player should sign a waiver and be like, I'm giving my brain to research.
I understand if you don't want to. That being said, like if I was a football player, unquestionably.
Yeah, but I mean, I feel like there are very few reasons why, and very few NFL players would actually qualify. You know what I mean? Like, not just being like, I don't want to. Like, come on, bro. Like, you're furthering the advancement of humanity.
I mean, I feel like that, but you can do what you want with your own brain. Yeah, and I think the other thing that people bring up with OJ is that after getting released from prison for this armed robbery, and I don't know if you remember this, J. Cole, he went on to post some videos on Twitter, which were, to put it generously, incredibly unsettling.
Yeah, they were very weird.
Yeah, him just, speaking to the camera, but it was, very, very creepy, to say the least. Another person who has been at the forefront of popular CTE allegations in recent years is the aforementioned Antonio Brown. Well, I think that this is a much more controversial to speak on than the OJ case. This is definitely a player I've heard a lot of people bring up when speaking about players who are potentially suffering from CTE.
I mean, after every single tweet, he tweets hashtag CTESPN. And he recently had the CTESPN Awards.
I did not know that.
Where he gave Pat McAfee Cracker of the Year.
Isn't that generous of him?
Yeah. So that's, I mean, he is very adamant that he has CTE. I know that.
Well, yeah, I mean him and apparently a lot of
others, but
unfortunately,
but he's part of that 30% of of people who actually believe they have it.
Well, I guess there's something about being aware.
Yeah.
I do wish the best to him. And lastly, before we move on to the more conspiratorial portion of this episode, I just want to touch on a very recent study which shed some light on just how prevalent this issue of CTE may be. In a recent study of former professional hockey players, it was discovered that 96.4% of players were found to have CTE. The severity of their CTE was directly correlated to the lengths of their careers. This was a shocking discovery. It was originally anticipated that far less players would have been the victims of CTE. Like, this is staggering numbers.
Yeah, like in hockey, like you obviously see players getting hit, but you don't think it to be as bad, you know?
Exactly.
Like it's more of just like a casual bump.
Let me give a little bit of a caveat, because this study was done on hockey players who have already passed away. So the majority of them were much older and played in a time period when safety regulations were not quite as strict. So it's possible, likely even, that a lot of these players were playing in an area where they weren't even wearing helmets.
Okay, so, well, I mean, I don't know about that, but maybe, I guess.
Yeah.
Helmets hasn't been that long since I started wearing helmets.
Exactly.
But I mean, even still, I feel like those numbers would still stay relatively high, even with...
I'm sure. We have no recent data yet based on the current stuff, the current regulations. But yes, I can't imagine that the number has gone down a huge, huge amount because...
Yeah, I mean, helmets are getting better, but hits are also getting harder, you know?
Yes, exactly. And after I actually found this hockey study, I found a little bit of a less recent study that really proved the point I was trying to prove with football specifically. And this one is absolutely crazy, if that one wasn't crazy enough. In 2017, the Journal of the American Medical Association published a study that found that of 111 former NFL players, 110 had CTE, a result of over 99%.
Wow, imagine being that one guy.
Yes, and also a caveat for this one is that this study likely suffers from selection bias, and this is why I brought the first one first, because these brains were mostly donated because the families of the deceased believes that their relative may have been suffering from CTE, but I find the results to be harrowing nonetheless.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing to believe they have CTE, but it's another thing for them to actually have CTE, and they were 110 for 111.
Exactly, and if you thought that 681 out of 1,980 was a big number, the reality is that of those NFL players, it's probably closer to 1,900 of them who actually have CTE, if these numbers are reflective of the entire population.
Wow.
Yeah, it's truly terrifying. So at this point of the episode, a lot of you may be wondering, where the hell does the conspiracy come in? After all, it's definitely not a conspiracy whether CTE exists or not. This is an undisputed fact, and, we just spoke about it for the past 20 minutes or so. As you might have gathered from the episode title, this conspiracy is the CTE Cover Up. J. Cole, do you know anything about the topic of the topic today?
I know a lot about the topic we're going to be discussing.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, I a couple of years ago, I went down a pretty deep rabbit hole about this whole CTE cover up and reading about specific players who should have been a part of their compensation who weren't.
Yes.
And terrible careers and injuries and suicides and assaults and just lot of shit went down because the NFL just decided to say you're lying.
Yes, exactly. And unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get nearly as into the weeds as I would like to. A lot of the stuff that J. Cole mentioned, I won't be able to bring up on this episode because I was planning on covering this entire topic and realized oh man, I got time for the origins, the very, very origins of this scandal. And in a later episode, I hope to bring you guys these stories that J. Cole was referring to. But for now, I just need to stick with telling you guys the story of how this all came to be. The story begins when concerns about CTE were on a huge rise. And in response to these concerns, the NFL had a less than ideal response. Well, the NFL had certainly acknowledged the danger posed to athletes in their league and have implemented many rules in the game to, make them more safe. Other actions taken by the league have been a lot more disconcerting. Possibly the best example of this conduct comes from an article titled "The NFL Tried to Intimidate Scientists Studying the Link Between Pro Football and Traumatic Brain Injury."
I mean, it doesn't get more fucked up than that.
Exactly. Incredibly descriptive. So this article was published on October 11th, 2017 by the Union of Concerned Scientists. The author was not named. The article begins like this.
Rather than honestly deal with its burgeoning concussion problem, the National Football League went after the reputation of the first doctor to link the sport to the degenerative brain disease he named chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I mean, they should know what chronic traumatic encephalopathy.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah. I'm sure that all the listeners are familiar.
Well, they are now.
I guess so. And you can't say that we're not educators. So, what happened here? What happened with this article? The story starts in 2002, when Dr. Bennett Omalu, a forensic pathologist, was conducting autopsies as a part of his regular duties. This particular morning, Omalu happened to be conducting an autopsy on Mike Webster, a Hall of Fame NFL center. After some initial analysis, Omalu made a decision which would end up having far more repercussions than he could have possibly imagined. He asked his assistant to preserve Webster's brain for additional testing. After said additional testing, Omalu made the discovery that Webster had CTE. For some context, all this was happening in a time when the NFL was being plagued by accusations of mishandling cases where players had suffered from concussions, either covering them up, failing to properly care for the players, or failing to implement rule changes aimed at limiting harm to the players. As a matter of fact, after a series of high-profile concussion-related retirements in the early 90s, Paul Tagliabue, the NFL's commissioner at the time, reluctantly created the Mild Traumatic Brain Injury Committee, which was dubbed MTBI. Famously, in 2003, the MTBI published research in the Journal of Neurosurgery, which was seen to have heavily downplayed the severity and frequency of concussions among NFL players. The NFL used this study to back up many of the decisions made around concussion protocol in the league. The study would go on to be heavily ridiculed by peer reviewers and even some of its own authors. Some researchers are said to have begun referring to the study as the Journal of No NFL Concussions. A further study undertaken by the New York Times in 2016 found that much of the data and concussions in the study are heavily flawed.
So basically, this is like McDonald's paying a bunch of scientists to be like, actually, Big Macs are healthy, and here is the proof. And McDonald's going, look, we have studies.
That is literally exactly it.
Love it.
You see this in a ton of industries where it's, lobbyists trying to downplay regulations. For example, the tobacco industry, where lobbyists are trying to say, like, oh, it's not as dangerous as you think to make cigarettes more accessible. And this happens in a lot of terrible areas. That being said, one place that I didn't think this was happening was the NFL, where, in my opinion, sports leagues have the huge incentive to protect their players.
Yeah, you would think, like, oh, they're the ones who are making us money, therefore we want to make sure they can make us money for as long as they possibly can.
That's exactly my thought process, but unfortunately, I think
it's too expensive to make sure that and there's always a next up-and-coming star who's just waiting to take the place.
I think the NFL really looks at these guys as disposable to some extent, which is incredibly sad. And, think about what we were speaking about during the Ben Roethlisberger episode, when we were speaking about players committing crimes, and sometimes the NFL covers it up and sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah.
It's all about the bottom line.
It's all about the bottom line.
So in 2005, when Dr. Bennett Omalu released his study about Webster having CTE, and this was ironically also published in the same journal, Neurosurgery, once this was published, it put the NFL on red alert. Omalu was releasing the exact sort of information the league has been trying so desperately to cover up. The part that was most troubling to the NFL was the conclusion made by Omalu that Webster's brain was found to have
neuropathological changes consistent with long-term repetitive concussive brain injury.
In non-medical talk, he had CTE because he was hit in the head so many times.
Yes.
Generally, when one study is disproven by another, the scientific community admits to the previous conclusions and that they were incorrect and begin working with the new information at hand. In this case, however, the NFL was not willing to accept Omalu's conclusions. After the publication of his study, Omalu received a letter from the MTBI calling for him to retract his research. In this letter, the MTBI did not disclose its relationship with the NFL, the fact that it was part of its umbrella.
Yeah.
The letter went on to claim that Omalu's research was quote-unquote completely wrong and that quote-unquote there is no history of brain trauma inside professional football.
What?
Yeah, I know. That is the bizarre claim I've ever heard.
It's just false. That's just straight false.
Yeah. Like, I could not... Did you know the Bills have 5 Super Bowl wins? Did you know that? This is exactly as true as this statement made by the NFL. There. Craziness. And keep in mind, this was all written even though the NFL Retirement Board, upon Webster's retirement, determined that he qualified for disability benefits because repeated head trauma had left him, quote-unquote, totally and permanently disabled. This information was unknown to Omalu.
Oh, fuck.
Yeah, so they're going after Omalu for his research that Webster has CTE after giving Webster extra pay after his retirement because he had brain trauma.
Yeah.
Little hard to admit that you didn't suspect this one.
Yeah, honestly.
In response to these attacks by the NFL, Omalu, and I thank him for this, would not back down. He went on to publish another paper in the same journal article, Neurosurgery, which showed that the former Steelers lineman, Terry Long, also suffered from CTE. The NFL, unsurprisingly, did their best to deny this finding as well. In 2007, when the NFL held a concussion summit, that is what it was officially called. I know.
I mean, yeah, that's a summit where they just give everyone concussions. You walk in the door and there's someone there with a chair just to slap you in the face. Welcome, come on in.
Yeah, welcome.
You are now qualified to talk.
Yeah, but, honestly, that is a way better image than I had in my mind, which is a bunch of guys in suits talking about concussions, which I'm sure is what it actually was.
No. Why would anyone do that?
Well, I mean, that is what they did. So, in 2007, they held this concussion summit, where they invited many researchers to speak about concussions, and Omalu was notably left off the list. Other researchers were subjected to pretty similar treatment by the league. That being said, someone was able to present Omalu's research. One of his colleagues was actually there and offered to present it because, he was essentially being blacklisted.
Yeah, someone had to do it.
Exactly.
Okay, that's tight.
Yeah, very nice. That is the bulk of the story of the NFL trying to absolutely tarnish this man's legacy and career and research, even though
he was
his peers seem to agree.
Truthful.
Exactly. After this, it seems like the cat was really let out of the bag, and despite their attempts to distract from the research, the NFL could not resist the momentum that was building. Because of this momentum, in 2009, Roger Goodell chose to disband the MTBI and replace it with a new research entity. In 2012, the NFL actually donated $30 million to the NIH for brain research. Unfortunately, it was coming.
Always a catch.
Yep. In this case, the NFL was accused of attempting to influence the research.
Oh, classic.
Yeah, and this actually forced the NIH to leave the $16 million of those dollars on the table because they can't take they legally can't take donations from people who are trying to influence their research.
I mean, fair.
So really, they spent $14 million on an unsuccessful lobbying campaign.
Good on them.
And I will give them credit. In the past handful of years, they have been doing some things to improve their ways. And we're quoting now.
In 2016, the NFL added both new concussion rules and a new $100 million initiative called Play Smart, Play Safe, with $60 million going towards technological developments, such as better helmets, and $40 million going toward medical research into head injuries. The league is additionally working on its $1 billion plan to settle the thousands of concussion lawsuits filed by former players. Still, concussions remain a major problem for the league and for the sport at large. Yeah, sometimes these concussions look pretty bad. I mean, like, Peyton Manning literally ended 2 guys' careers, so, like...
Yes. Even with all these initiatives, many continue to accuse the NFL of failing to do everything they can to help their athletes, and I am sympathetic to this view, personally.
Yeah.
I think I think there's a lot more that could be done to make the game safer. And I hope this is realized soon with the amount of players who are beginning to speak out about it. Well, much of the discourse I've seen surrounding this has referred to this chain of events as a conspiracy. I'm more comfortable calling this a scandal. After going through all of this, I find this to be credible reporting with substantial evidence backing up their claims. It pains me that so much effort has been put into the mission to stop effective research into brain trauma suffered by NFL players. I'm glad to see the NFL has improved in recent years, but I firmly believe that not enough is being done, and we need to do everything we can to protect these players. Not only will the research directly benefit NFL players, it will also serve to contribute to this field of study overall. To me, it feels like a win-win. But I suppose to some officials in the NFL, it is more worthwhile to protect the reputation of the league than it is to protect the health of their players. I hope everyone found this a very educational and informative episode, and for anyone who is interested in learning more about this topic, I recommend checking out the book League of Denial by Mark Fainaru-Wada and Steve Fainaru. It is filled with stories about this scandal and really covers it in a comprehensive way, and anyone who wants to learn more would be serviced by reading this book.
Or you could watch the movie Concussion with Will Smith. It also touches on a lot of this stuff for people who don't like to read.
That is totally fair.
Alrighty, welcome to the end segment.
Wow, the enthusiasm is
Let me try
infectious.
Again. Alrighty, welcome to the finale section where
you sound like Barney the dinosaur. Like, this is...
well, even though it's playoffs, we're going to talk about a non-playoff team. Just because they had, like, a very memeable, discussionable, hilarious season.
I could not even imagine who you're talking about.
Oh, well, it's the Cleveland Browns.
I honestly can say that I know almost nothing about the Cleveland Browns season this episode, so I'm some fresh meat for this topic.
So, the Cleveland Browns in 2024 finished with a worse point differential than the season they went 0-16.
Wait, really? What was the record this season?
3-14.
That is tough.
Their point differential this season was negative 177, and it was the second worst in the league. The only team that was worse was Carolina, but classic Carolina.
So Carolina's
minus
point differential
193.
It's also way worse than the point differential of the Browns 0-16 season.
Yes, exactly. Which, yikes.
That's honestly pretty, like, surprising. Those are some terrible losses, yeah.
But I don't know. I feel like this season, like, except for Cincinnati, I would say everyone ended up where they should have.
I would definitely say there's some teams that...
Like the bottom teams sucked, and the
top
good
teams were good.
Won.
Yeah, I guess you're right. The only huge exception is the Bengals. You are right.
Yeah, if a team was going to win, they won, and if a team was going to lose, they lost.
Yeah, I guess you're right. Only one team didn't make it to the playoffs that really should have.
Yeah. So the Browns led the NFL in pre-snap penalties in back-to-back years, okay?
Mm-hmm.
54 last year, 61 this year. As in, their opponents were not a factor. A category of stupid that is self-inflicting yet in your control to fix. They led the NFL in this stat. They said meh and got worse.
They got worse?
They went from 54 to 61.
That is embarrassing. Yeah, like, it's literally just, like, it's shit coaching. That is all it is.
Yeah. Terrible
system, terrible coaching. They need, like, that cannot be the player's fault. To some extent, like it's got to go higher than that.
No, that's about 305 penalty yards.
300, like
That just on pre-snap penalties.
that. It's actually
Yeah.
dreadful. It's embarrassing, really.
The Browns' offense, out of 798 teams through 6 games since 2000. Red zone trips, tied for 784th. Offensive penalties, tied for 795th. Yards to go on third down, 795th. Third down conversion rate, 797th.
The fact that these stats have even been collated is insane. How bad they are is actually like it's astronomical.
Ridiculous.
Yeah,
like that is like next level terrible.
Yeah, and it must be worse for the Panthers.
Yeah, but the Panthers are just perpetually bad. They're not as cursed of a franchise as it's not as funny to rag on Carolina.
No. I'm not trying to. Yeah, no, you're right. You're right.
Like,
we don't get any. I don't get any pleasure out of ragging on Carolina.
Like they suffer enough.
Exactly.
Like,
honestly, it's pity mostly at this point.
Yeah, and then finally, the Browns are +5 in takeaways in their last game. Since the Browns returned to the NFL, teams with a turnover margin of +5 or better in a game are 132, 4-1. The Browns are responsible for 2 of those losses.
Wow. Wait, 134, 2-1.
132,
4-1. Okay.
And
for a second, I was like, they're responsible for every loss, but no, just 50% of them.
50% of them, exactly, yeah.
The least clutch you could possibly be.
Yeah. Wait, I lied. I have one more. The Browns blew a 13-point lead in the final 1 minute and 22 seconds to lose to the New York Jets 31-30. NFL teams had won the last 2,229 consecutive games when leading by at least 13 points in the final 2 minutes. The last team to blow such a lead? The Cleveland Browns.
No!
Week 9 of 2001.
Actually, like
they're literally what started the streak and ended the streak.
I'm as terrible as this is, I'm starting to like feel like sympathy for them because I feel like we could find like some exact podcast out there that is having this exact conversation about the Toronto Maple Leafs.
I mean, yeah, we could have that conversation.
No, we can't have that conversation. No. I prefer not. This is a football podcast. We really shouldn't be talking about hockey here.
But, I mean, in general, we could do, like, a literal 15-minute episode each week on just Cleveland Brown being cursed.
Yeah. It is, it's a sad state of affairs down there in the Is there anything notable about that city?
The land? What do they? Is that what they call them? Is that they're called the land? Yeah.
They call themselves the. Okay.
It's like why go to the Big Apple when you go to the land?
Okay.
Windy City? Nah.
The land. Thank you for listening to this week's episode.
You can find us on Twitter at FB Conspiracies, where we will post all the graphics and links we spoke about during this episode.
You can also reach us by email using fbconspiracies@gmail.com.
A special thanks to Blaze for the music.
If you enjoyed, consider leaving a review.
Join us next week for more football conspiracies.
In